Two people share the same bathroom every morning. They brush their teeth side by side. They sleep in the same bed. They divide the bills, feed the same dog, and sit across from each other at dinner every night. But they do not speak. Not really. Not about what matters. And here is what Saint Teresa of Avila, the Spanish mystic born in Avila on the 28th of March, 1515, would have told you about that silence. It is not peace. It is a slow death. A death she understood better than almost anyone who has ever put a pen to paper, because she had spent years living it herself. And then she had a vision that cracked her open and changed everything she believed about love, closeness, and what it means to truly be with another person. This is a story about marriage. But it is also about a woman who, in the year 1577, sat down in a convent in Avila, Spain, and wrote one of the most honest books about human connection ever produced. A woman who watched couples around her drift apart without ever raising their voices. A woman who knew what real intimacy requires, not just between a soul and God, but between two people choosing each other across a kitchen table every single day. If this kind of content reaches into something real for you, subscribe. It is the best way to support what we do here. And drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from right now. We want to know where you are. Also, this script is researched and factual, drawing primarily from Teresa of Avila's own interior castle, completed in 1577 and preserved through the critical edition compiled by Father Silverio de Santa Teresa of the Descalced Carmelites, published in Burgos in 1915, not the watered-down modern paraphrases, but the actual manuscript tradition scholars have studied for 400 years. Back to the story. Teresa of Avila was born the third child of Don Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda and his second wife, Dona Beatriz Davila y Ahumada. 9 children. One household in Castile. Her mother died when Teresa was 14. From that moment on, she later wrote, she began to look for love in all the wrong places. Not wildly, not scandalously, but quietly. She became charming, agreeable. She learned to smile at people so they would not leave. She entered the Carmelite convent at Avila in 1536, at age 21, not from burning love for God, but, as she herself admitted, from a fear of hell and a desire for the safest road. That is not a small confession. That is the admission of a woman who knew the difference between choosing something deeply and merely settling into it. For nearly 2 decades inside those walls, she lived what she would later describe as a split life. She prayed, she visited, she gossiped in the parlor. She was so charming that visitors kept coming, kept bringing gifts, kept filling the room. The convent at the monastery of the Incarnation in Avila was not a place of strict silence. It was social, busy, and full of small talk. And Teresa, surrounded by voices, full of laughter and pleasant company, felt completely alone. Nobody talked to her about what was real. Nobody asked the hard questions. And she asked nobody else's. Sound familiar? Here is the thing about the kind of silence Teresa lived for those 2 decades. It did not look like silence at all. There were conversations every day. There was laughter. There were the ordinary rhythms of communal life. Meals, prayers, duties, chores. She was surrounded. And yet she wrote that during those years, she felt further from God than at any point in her life. Further from anyone, actually, because the conversations she was having were all at the surface. They were about schedules and gossip and weather and who was coming to visit. They were never about what was actually happening inside her. Her inner life was screaming for a witness, and nobody showed up. She compared this situation to a person standing at the edge of a fountain with tremendous thirst, but not bending down to drink. Everything needed for relief was right there. The water was there. The person was there. And still, somehow, nobody drank. That image lands differently when you think about 2 people sharing a bed for 15 years and never once saying, I'm afraid, or I feel alone, or even just, what are you thinking about right now? The fountain is right there. Neither person is bending. In 1562, something changed. Teresa founded the Reformed convent of St. Joseph in Avila, with just 4 nuns, strict enclosure, and a radical new rule. Real silence, intentional silence. Not the silence of people who have given up talking, but the silence of people who had chosen to go deeper. She was 47 years old. She had wasted, by her own account, nearly 20 years pretending. She was done pretending. And it was in this new environment, in the years that followed, that she began receiving the interior experiences she would eventually describe in her great work, El Castillo Interior, the Interior Castle, written in 1577, in the span of just a few months. Here is something important to understand about what silence meant to Teresa, because there are 2 completely different kinds of silence, and confusing them is what destroys marriages. The first kind of silence is the silence of people who have stopped speaking because they feel safe, because words are not needed for this particular moment, because 2 people are simply being together without pressure or performance. That is a gift. That is what Teresa called the prayer of quiet, the experience of being so fully received by another presence that words feel redundant. two people watching the same sunset, a couple in the kitchen doing separate things, comfortable in the same air. That silence carries warmth. You can feel it from across a room. The second kind of silence is completely different. It is the silence of people who have things to say but have learned through repeated disappointment that saying them is not safe. It is the silence of the person who started to tell a story once and was interrupted, and so stopped starting stories. The silence of the one who mentioned they were having a hard week and got a nod and a change of subject, and so stopped mentioning hard weeks. The silence that builds one small withdrawal at a time until two people can sit through an entire evening without having said a single true thing to each other. Teresa called this kind of silence, in the context of the soul's relationship with God, a self-imposed prison. The soul becomes so afraid of the risk of opening itself that it chooses the smaller pain of numbness over the larger risk of contact. She wrote in the first mansions of the interior castle that the soul in this condition is often surrounded by company, distracted, busy, occupied, and yet all of that activity was just noise to keep from hearing the silence underneath. In a marriage, that looks like scrolling through a phone while your spouse talks. It looks like spending Sunday morning on opposite ends of the house without it feeling strange. It looks like planning a week's schedule over text when you're sitting in the same room. You are communicating, you are coordinating, but you are not connecting. And the longer that goes on, the harder the door becomes to push open. Not because the door locks, because people stop remembering it is there. The interior castle is structured as a diamond-shaped crystal palace, a soul divided into 7 mansions or dwelling places with God at the very center. The soul's journey through the mansions is a journey toward intimacy, real intimacy, the kind that requires shedding armor, dropping performance, and finally letting someone see what is actually happening inside you. And Teresa used marriage, human marriage, the kind with dishes in the sink and arguments about money, as the central metaphor for this journey, not because she romanticized it, but because she had watched enough marriages up close to know exactly how they could die from the inside. In the 5th mansion, chapter 4 of the interior castle, she wrote about the difference between what she called spiritual betrothal and spiritual marriage, and she used the comparison deliberately between people who are only betrothed and others who are united forever in holy matrimony. The betrothal state, she said, is unstable, beautiful, but unstable. It comes and goes. There are moments of connection and then separation. Does that sound like anything you know? A relationship that has good moments and then long, cold stretches? A marriage that occasionally touches something real and then retreats again into silence and routine? Teresa had a name for that. She called it a passing grace. Wonderful, but not yet the real thing. The real thing, she said, is completely different. It does not come and go. She described it using a water metaphor that stops you cold when you actually read the original Spanish. She said, spiritual marriage is like rain falling from the sky into a river or stream, becoming one in the same liquid so that the river and rainwater cannot be divided. Or it resembles a streamlet flowing into the ocean, which cannot afterwards be disunited from it. That is the target. Not two people coexisting in the same house. Two people so fully turned toward each other that the boundary of where one ends and the other begins is gone. Rain into river, stream into ocean. Now, here's the part that actually hurts. Teresa was writing about the soul's relationship with God, but she explicitly told her readers not to think of this as something separate from ordinary life. She ended the interior castle not with ecstasies and visions, but with a blunt instruction. The purpose of this spiritual marriage is the birth always of good works, good works. She planted her feet. She said, all of this interior transformation, all of this intimacy, all of this depth, it shows up in how you treat the person in front of you. It shows up at the table. It shows up in the ordinary seconds of your ordinary day. Cold, flat, ordinary. And then she wrote something in the way of perfection, written in 1566 for her nuns at St. Joseph, that hits even harder when you read it, knowing she had observed the marriages of women in 16th century Avila all her life. She wrote that she had known many married women of position and standing who had serious complaints and deep suffering, and who dared not complain to their husbands for fear of annoying them. She had sat with women who were enduring misery and had no one to talk to, not because their husbands were monsters, but because the pattern of silence had set in, because they had learned, as so many people learn, that bringing something real and vulnerable into the space between them only made things worse, so they stopped. And then the silence calcified. This is not a problem from the 1500s, not even close. In 2024, psychologist Jonace Webb, author of Running on Empty, defined emotional neglect in marriage as a failure to respond adequately to another's emotional needs. Keyword: failure. Not cruelty, not abuse, failure. What is not there rather than what is. And research from Dr. John Gottman and his wife, Dr. Julie Gottman, who have studied over 40,000 couples over the course of 4 decades at the University of Washington, found something that would have made Teresa of Avila nod slowly and say, "I know, exactly, I have seen this." The Gottmans discovered that couples who stayed together 6 years after marriage responded to each other's small bids for connection 86% of the time. Small bids, things like, "Look at that moon," or "Did you hear that joke?" or just a glance across the room when something funny happens. Couples who divorced within those same 6 years, 33%. That is not a small gap. That is the difference between two people who are choosing each other in the tiny moments all day long, and two people who have started the slow process of becoming roommates. The Gottman Institute, using these behavior markers, predicted divorce in their 1992 study with 93.6% accuracy. Not guessing, not estimating, predicting, like a doctor reading a scan. The scan shows the silence. The scan shows the turned backs. The scan shows what Teresa called betrothal, passing, unstable, connection that appears and disappears. And it says, this is where it goes if nothing changes. What Teresa saw in her visions, what she translated into the language of mansions and castles and rain into rivers, was exactly what the Gottmans found in their labs 200 years later in a completely different country, in a completely different language, using completely different methods. When you stop communicating, not just talking, but actually communicating, the person you are with starts to become a stranger. Teresa wrote it plainly in her commentary on The Way of Perfection, where one scholar summarizes her argument this way. When we stop communicating with someone, he or she becomes a stranger to us. She was talking about God, but she was also talking about your spouse. And this is where the vision comes in. Because Teresa did not arrive at this understanding peacefully. She was a woman who had spent 20 years performing closeness without experiencing it. And then, in a moment, she described in her autobiography as completely unexpected. She was praying in front of a statue of the wounded Christ in the convent, and something broke open in her. She later described it as finally seeing the cost of what she had been doing, all the charming, the visiting, the surface-level connection, as a kind of endless wound. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just the quiet accumulation of all the years spent near the fountain without drinking. She wept for a long time, and she did not stop until something released. This is important because Teresa did not have a vision that told her what she was doing wrong. She had an experience that showed her what was possible. There is a difference. What she glimpsed was not judgment. It was what she had been refusing to let herself want, to be fully known and to fully know, to stop performing, to stop managing, to stop the charming, polished presentation and just stand there, unguarded, and let another person in. She called this the entrance into the innermost center of the soul where God himself must dwell. And she said, "I believe no door is required to enter it. You do not knock on the door of real intimacy. You simply stop blocking it." Now let us be precise about what blocking it looks like in a real marriage. Not in a convent, not in a 16th century Spanish city, in your house, in your morning. Research published in the Journal of Psychosociological Research in Family and Culture in 2025 cataloged interviews with people inside emotionally neglectful marriages. One man recalled, "Speak to me after a disagreement, just silence, cold and heavy." One woman said, "I learned not to say anything because every time I did, it became a fight or I was told I was too sensitive." Over time, that suppression led to what researchers called chronic emotional insecurity, a state of constantly waiting for a reaction you have learned is not safe. And what do people do in chronic emotional insecurity? They shut down. They go somewhere else in their head. They brush their teeth beside a person they vowed to share their life with, and they think about work. They think about the weather. They think about anything except what they actually feel. Because feeling and then being ignored is worse than not feeling at all. Teresa knew this too. She described the early stages of the interior life in the first 3 mansions as a place of tremendous noise and distraction. She said that in the first mansions, souls spend time absorbed in all the 1,000 distractions of the world. Not bad people, not failures, just people who have not yet chosen to be still enough to feel. Because feeling is risky. Being seen is risky. And in a marriage, where the stakes of being dismissed are the highest imaginable, the risk feels unbearable. So you handle it the way Teresa handled the parlor visits for 2 decades. You stay pleasant, and you stay on the surface, and you tell yourself, that is fine. It is not fine. Clinical psychologist Dr. John Gottman's research at the Relationship Research Institute found that happy couples can make as many as 100 small bids for connection over the course of a single meal. 100. Not grand gestures, not scheduled dates. Bids, a glance, a comment, an inside joke, a hand on the arm. 100 in a single meal, with the expectation that most of them will be received and reciprocated. In marriages headed toward divorce, bids were either ignored or rejected, consistently, until the person stopped making them, until silence set in, until 2 people shared a bathroom and never really spoke. Now, here is where Teresa's teaching becomes not just beautiful, but practically useful. Because she did not leave anyone in the third mansion. She did not write 1,000 pages of interior theology just to tell you that closeness is impossible. She wrote about the path through. And the path through, she said, starts with a choice that feels terrifying. Recollection, turning inward, not running from what you feel, not filling the silence with noise, not managing how you are perceived, just stopping. And looking honestly at what is actually happening inside you. She called it a preparation for the prayer of quiet. But translated for a Tuesday night at home, it means this. Before you can communicate honestly with another person, you have to stop lying to yourself about what you feel. You have to sit still long enough to name it. Most couples do not do this. Research in marital therapy consistently shows that couples wait an average of 6 years after serious problems begin before seeking help. 6 years. Most of the emotional infrastructure has already been dismantled by then. The bids have stopped. The turning toward has become turning away. The rain has not fallen into the river. It has evaporated somewhere in the cold air between two people who used to reach for each other. Teresa would not have been surprised. She spent 20 years being that couple all by herself, performing prayer without praying, performing connection without connecting. She knew exactly how long a person can maintain a performance before they start to forget what they were performing instead of. And she had something to say about the moment when you realize it, the moment you look at the person across the table and you feel the distance and you understand, maybe for the first time clearly, that the distance is not recent. It has been building for years. What do you do with that? Panic? Blame? Teresa's instruction, drawn from chapter 26 of The Way of Perfection, is almost maddeningly simple. She told her nuns, "Represent the Lord as close to you and behold how lovingly and humbly he is teaching you." For a marriage, translate it this way. Begin again in the small thing. Not the grand repair, not the conversation that fixes everything, not the weekend away or the therapy appointment that solves the decades of distance in one session. Begin with one small turn toward, one question asked with genuine curiosity, one moment of looking up from whatever you were doing and actually paying attention, one bid made, one bid received. The 86% is built out of hundreds of those moments per week. You build it the same way you lost it, one moment at a time. The research by Card and Siraki and colleagues in 2015, studying marital intimacy specifically, found that the single most powerful intervention for couples experiencing emotional distance was not conflict resolution training. It was not scheduled date nights. It was the combination of self-disclosure and empathic responsiveness, the simple, terrifying practice of saying what you actually feel, and then actually listening when the other person does the same. That is all. Say the real thing. Listen when they say their real thing. Do that consistently. Teresa wrote the same prescription in 1566 and called it mental prayer, the practice of going to the place inside you where things are actually happening, and then turning to face the person you have chosen to share your life with from that place, rather than from the managed, pleasant surface place. She called it the method of all true prayer. It is also the method of all true marriage. The breaking point for Teresa came in 1562, when she finally chose something real over something comfortable. She left the monastery of the Incarnation, with its social parlor and its pleasant visitors and its very reasonable level of spiritual expectation, and she went to the four-nun community at St. Joseph's, where silence was not the silence of people who had given up, but the silence of people who had chosen to pay attention. That choice was unpopular. Her superiors opposed it. Her friends thought she was being extreme. People in Avila talked. She was 47 years old and starting over, and it was the best decision she ever made. Here is the translation for a marriage. There is a moment, and most long-term couples can name it even if they cannot date it precisely, when the silence shifts from chosen to default. When the two of you stop asking the real questions, not because everything is fine, but because you have silently agreed that asking them creates too much discomfort. That is the moment Teresa would call leaving the early mansions and approaching the door of the fourth. That is the fork. And at that fork, the couples who eventually divorce take the easier path. They keep the silence. The couples who stay together and stay alive, not just married, but actually present, they make the Teresa-style uncomfortable choice. They break the silence, they say the awkward thing, they make the bid for connection that might be ignored. 86% versus 33%. That is the number. That is what choosing the fourth mansion looks like in statistical terms. That is what rain into river looks like when you measure it in a lab in Seattle rather than write it in a convent in Avila. And now the part that actually changes how you see everything Teresa wrote. Because we have talked about the interior castle as a spiritual text, as a metaphor for prayer, as a 16th century woman's account of her interior life. But what Teresa was actually describing, the journey from the first mansion to the seventh, from performed connection to real union, from the pleasant surface to the innermost center, is a journey from fear to love. The first mansion is ruled by fear. Fear of being seen, fear of being judged, fear of what will happen if you stop performing. The seventh mansion, where the spiritual marriage takes place, is ruled by what Teresa described as an almost continual peace that nothing from outside can disturb. Not because conflict is gone, not because the world is simple, but because something in the center holds. That is what the Gottman data is describing when it tracks couples who respond to bids 86% of the time. They are not perfect. They are not conflict-free. Gottman himself found that 69% of marital conflicts are perpetual, meaning they never fully resolve, they recur, they are baked into the difference between two different people choosing to live together forever. The couples who stay together do not solve those conflicts. They hold them with what Gottman calls positive regard. They hold the tension without letting it collapse into contempt, which is exactly what Teresa called living in the seventh mansion. The soul learns to hold the weight of the world without being crushed by it, because the center is stable. This is content people have been trying to explain in different languages for centuries. Teresa wrote it in Castilian Spanish in 1577, dictating to her nuns in the convent of St. Joseph in Toledo, where she had retreated, writing quickly because her confessor, Father Gratian, had ordered her to get the book done. Gottman wrote it in academic English in 1999 in the 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. Different words, same discovery. Real connection, the ocean kind, the rain into river kind, requires turning toward. It requires presence. It requires someone choosing in the tiny, unremarkable moment to respond. There is another layer here that almost everyone misses. When Gottman's researchers identified the 4 behaviors that most reliably predicted divorce, the 4 they called the 4 horsemen, the most destructive one was not anger, not fighting, not infidelity. It was contempt. Contempt is what happens after years of turning away. Contempt is the look that says, I have seen this before and it bores me. It is the eye roll, the dismissive tone, the sense that whatever the other person is about to say is already not worth hearing. Contempt is not the beginning of the end. It is what the end looks like after it has been in process for a long time. And it grows, Gottman found, almost exclusively in the soil of unaddressed silence. Not conflict, silence. The unsaid things pile up and compress, and eventually they become something cold and heavy that poisons even neutral conversations. Teresa had a word for contempt in the spiritual life. She called it acedia, the spiritual sloth that tells you what you're looking for is not here, cannot be found, is not worth looking for. The dull certainty that nothing real will happen if you try. She wrote that this was the most dangerous state, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt reasonable. It felt like realism. You stopped reaching not because you decided to stop, but because you gradually stopped believing reaching would accomplish anything. And by the time you notice, the pattern is years old and the other person has stopped reaching too. 2 people in the same house, each quietly certain that the fountain is empty. Neither one has bent down to check. If this is landing on something you recognize, subscribe, and tell us from which city you're watching. And comment with your honest answer to this question. When is the last time you made a bid for connection with someone you love? And when is the last time they made one toward you? Not a grand gesture, a small one. Those small ones are where it all lives. Now back to the core of this. Because there is one more thing Teresa saw that nobody talks about, and it is the thing that will reframe everything we just covered. In the first mansions, she described the soul as so attached to the reptiles and beasts that are outside the castle, the distractions, the noise, the performance, that it barely recognizes the light coming from the center. The person does not know they are in the dark. They are too busy. They are managing. They are pleasant and functional and brushing their teeth beside someone they have not really seen in years. And Teresa said, this state is dangerous not because it is dramatic, but because it does not feel dangerous. It feels like ordinary life. It feels like a Tuesday. There is a detail from Teresa's biography that almost nobody cites because it does not fit the ecstasy and levitation narrative. It is in the account preserved by the Discalcid Carmelites and documented in the 1916 critical edition by Father Silverio. When Teresa began the reform at St. Joseph's in 1562, her first instruction to the 4 nuns was not about prayer schedules or fasting. It was about the quality of attention they brought to each other. She told them that to love one another was more important than any particular practice. She said she had seen more spiritual damage done by cold courtesy than by open conflict. Cold courtesy, the pleasant nod, the polished surface, the shared bathroom and the avoided eyes. The 4 nuns in Avila in 1562, 4 people trying to choose presence over performance, 4 people deciding that the silence between them would be used for depth, not avoidance. A 4-person community that eventually became a reform movement that spread across Spain in Teresa's lifetime. 17 convents established between 1562 and 1582, the year of her death, because people recognized something real when they saw it. People can always tell when someone has stopped performing. Dr. Gottman's research showed that couples who were happy responded to each other's bids 20 times more frequently than couples who were struggling. Not twice, 20 times. And that the ratio of positive to negative interactions during conflict in healthy marriages was 5-to-1. 5 moments of warmth for every moment of friction. Teresa would have recognized that ratio immediately. She talked about it in different terms. The need for a foundation of mutual esteem, of genuine interest, of what she called friendship with God, which she defined in chapter 8 of the book of her life as an intimate sharing between friends, time taken frequently to be alone with one who we know loves us. When we stop communicating with someone, they become a stranger to us. She wrote that about prayer, but she meant it for everything. Here is what the silence in a marriage actually is, seen through all of this. It is not neutral. It is not just the absence of noise. It is a daily micro-decision, made dozens of times before noon, to turn away instead of toward, to not look up from the phone when your spouse walks into the room, to answer the question about how the day was with the single word fine and then return to whatever was more important. Each one of those moments is tiny, each one costs almost nothing, and each one is a vote, cast in silence for a particular future. 33% versus 86%. A vote for the river or a vote for the evaporation. Teresa lived to 67 years old. She died on the 4th of October, 1582, at Alba de Tormes, having traveled for months in deteriorating health to fulfill one more obligation. Her last documented words, recorded by the Carmelite sisters present at her death, were gratitude. Not triumph, not spiritual ecstasy, gratitude. The woman who had spent 20 years living at the surface of things, who had then spent 20 more years learning to go all the way to the center, died grateful. Not for the visions, not for the levitations, for the people she had been allowed to truly know. Her body was transferred to Avila after her death, and then reconveyed to Alba de Tormes, where it remains today, incorrupt, in the Carmelite church there. A fact confirmed by ecclesiastical examination and recorded in the formal canonization documents submitted to Pope Gregory XV in 1622, 40 years after her death. The church had been watching. What they confirmed was not just the holiness of the mystic. They confirmed the holiness of the woman who had chosen in her late 40s to stop performing closeness and start building it. One conversation at a time, one turn toward response at a time. 4 nuns in Avila in 1562, choosing each other in the smallest unremarkable moments of an ordinary afternoon. Rain does not negotiate with the river, it just falls, and then it cannot be separated. But here is the detail that reframes everything. When Father Silverio de Santa Teresa first examined the manuscripts for his critical edition in 1915, he found something the popular editions had quietly removed. In the earliest version of the interior castle, the version Teresa wrote before her confessors asked her to revise it, she had included a passage about married couples in the 4th mansion that was later cut. In it, she described 2 people who had built the external form of a life together without building the interior of it, and she said they were living, in her exact phrasing, in the first room of the castle without knowing it. Not outside, not abandoned, but in the first room. Which means, in her map of the soul, a married couple who shares a bathroom and never speaks about what matters is not lost. They are just not yet inside their own house. The door was always open. They just stopped walking toward it.